Then, on final approach, the fuel temperature on Flight 38 was minus 22 degrees centigrade, which is unusually low for this phase of flight. This was because the aircraft had been flying in unusually cold air for the previous 11 hours, and the fuel temperature remained well below freezing throughout the flight. This meant that any ice which had been accumulating in the fuel lines during the flight remained there even during the approach, when the fuel would typically be warmer. This ice occurs naturally in fuel, and so it should not have been a problem for the fuel system. However, the fuel temperatures during much of the flight were in the so-called sticky range, where ice crystals are most likely to adhere to their surroundings. During the initial descent, the engines were on low power, meaning that the fuel flow was low, and this ice remained stuck to the fuel pipes. However, when the plane was on final approach and there were engine accelerations, this increase in fuel flow dislodged the ice, causing it to flow through the fuel system and form a restriction on the face of the fuel oil heat exchanger, pictured here. This blockage was enough to significantly reduce the fuel flow to the engines, causing the reduction in thrust. Here's a picture from the final report into this accident, which shows just how unusual this particular set of circumstances were on British Airways Flight 38. Each of these dots is a flight conducted by British Airways 777. The vertical axis shows the amount of fuel delivered by each main tank, which is below 20 degrees centigrade, and with a maximum fuel flow of 10,000 pounds per hour. In other words, Flight 38, which is the outlier at the top of this graph, consumed about 25,000 kilograms of fuel from each tank at minus 20 degrees and at a maximum rate of 10,000 pounds per hour. The takeaway from this chart is that it is highly unusual for a 777 to consume this much cold fuel at this lower rate of fuel consumption. In these very specific and unusual conditions, ice may build up in the fuel lines, and when engine thrust is increased closer to landing, it may be dislodged, where it travels through the fuel lines and causes an obstruction at the fuel oil heat exchange. The certification requirements for the engines and the fuel system did not require them to be invulnerable to this phenomenon, as it was simply not known about at the time. As a result of this accident, Rolls-Royce, the manufacturer of the engines, changed the design of the fuel oil heat exchanger so that it was less vulnerable to ice build-up under these conditions. Boeing also recommended that if pilots suspect a fuel icing problem, they should bring the thrust back to idle for 30 seconds, then increase the thrust to clear the blockage. This could not have been done on British Airways Flight 38, however, given how close it was to the ground when the loss of thrust occurred. In the end, it was miraculous that this flight ended as well as it did. A near total loss of engine thrust on short finals is a life-threatening situation, and the quick-thinking actions of the flight crew saved many lives on board. After the crash, Boeing test pilots spent months recreating the landing in a full-motion Boeing 777 simulator, and were unable to achieve a further glide than was achieved by the pilots on this day. Since these changes to the design of the fuel oil heat exchanger, there has not been another similar accident on the Boeing 777, and it remains to this day one of the safest passenger aircraft in the sky.